In the autumn of 1936, a young photographer climbed to a vantage point above a construction site in the remote plains of northeastern Montana. What she saw through her lens was unlike anything America had ever attempted. Towering earthworks rose from the Missouri River Valley. Thousands of men moved like ants across an ocean of mud and machinery. Margaret Bourke-White pressed the shutter. That photograph of Fort Peck Dam's massive spillway, its curved concrete forms rising with geometric power against the prairie sky, became the cover of the very first issue of Life magazine on November 23, 1936. It announced to the world that something extraordinary was rising in Montana, and it was only half finished. The story of Fort Peck Dam begins not with engineers or blueprints, but with desperation. The year was 1933. The Great Depression had broken the American economy with a force that seemed almost biblical. Millions were out of work. Banks had failed. Farms had failed. The Great Plains, already battered by years of drought that would soon earn the name Dust Bowl, offered little hope for the families who had staked their lives upon it. President Franklin Roosevelt had come into office with a singular promise, a New Deal, and one of its most powerful instruments was the Public Works Administration. Fort Peck Dam was among its grandest and most ambitious gestures. The Missouri River had long been a force unto itself. Unpredictable, powerful, and ancient, it had carved the heart of the American continent over thousands of years. It flooded without mercy and ran shallow without warning. Taming even a portion of it had been a dream for engineers and politicians for decades. Fort Peck would be the answer. A dam of almost incomprehensible scale that would provide flood control, improve navigation along the river's lower reaches, and eventually generate electricity for a region starved of both power and economic hope. The site chosen sat on a stretch of the Missouri in the wide, windswept country near Glasgow, Montana, adjacent to the small community of Fort Peck. Named for a 19th century fur trading post that once served the commerce of the northern plains, the location was remote, cold, and deeply unforgiving. Getting men, equipment, and materials to this corner of the country required an enormous logistical effort before a single shovel broke ground. But the promise of work, steady, government-backed, paying work, drew men from every corner of a suffering nation. At the project's peak in July of 1936, more than 10,500 workers were on the payroll. Boomtowns appeared almost overnight from the Montana prairie. Wheeler, Macomb City, and more than a dozen others rose to house the flood of workers and their families. A formal government town was constructed specifically for Army Corps of Engineers personnel and those in positions of responsibility. Many of those original structures, the Recreation Center, the Fort Peck Theater, still welcome visitors today, tangible remnants of a New Deal world. The engineering challenge was staggering in every dimension. The method chosen for construction was hydraulic fill, a technique in which massive electric dredges pump a slurry of water and excavated earth material into position, allowing gravity and time to do the work of settling and consolidation. 4 enormous dredges were required. Because the site sat so far from any navigable coast, a makeshift shipyard was constructed directly on location to build them. Workers named it, with a mixture of pride and dry humor, the Fort Peck Navy. The biggest shipyard in Montana, they called it, which was almost certainly true. The geology beneath the Missouri River at this location presented severe and layered complications. Below approximately 160 feet of alluvial deposits, mixtures of coarse sands, gravels, and impermeable clays deposited over millennia, lay a thick formation of bear paw shale, in places nearly 1,000 feet deep. Within that shale were thin but treacherous seams of bentonite, a clay mineral with a notorious capacity for instability when subjected to pressure and moisture. The danger of seepage through the porous foundation material was real and potentially catastrophic. The engineer's solution was a steel sheet pile wall, driven continuously from one valley wall to the other, anchored deep into the firm shale below. It was painstaking, grinding work, performed foot by foot across the entire width of the valley. The dam that emerged from this effort is a structure of almost defiant scale. It stretches nearly 4 miles from abutment to abutment, more precisely, 21,026 feet. At over 250 feet in height, it remains to this day the largest hydraulically filled dam in the United States. The reservoir it created, Fort Peck Lake, reaches more than 130 miles into the Montana interior, plunges to depths of 200 feet, and wraps a shoreline of 1,520 miles around its many arms and inlets. That shoreline is longer than the entire Pacific coastline of California. The lake sits within the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge, a vast and hauntingly beautiful landscape that now draws hunters, anglers, and naturalists from across the continent. But the path to completion carried a terrible weight. On the morning of September 22, 1938, a routine inspection by the engineer in charge revealed something deeply wrong. A pipeline near a critical section of the upstream shell sat measurably too close to the core pool, 2 full feet lower than engineering specifications required. A survey crew was dispatched immediately. A meeting of district engineers and supervisory personnel was called for 1:15 that afternoon, to be held near the troubled section itself. They never finished that meeting. At almost precisely 1:15, the core pool near that section began to settle, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. Then with gathering, terrible momentum, cracks tore through the embankment 30 feet below the crest. The upstream shell began sliding backward. Then the entire mass, an enormous, irreversible wall of earth, began translating southward toward the reservoir, rotating slightly as it went. One construction supervisor, backing his car away from the advancing collapse along the upstream beach, later recalled that the scarp of earth was keeping pace with him at roughly 10 miles per hour. A pump barge moored near the east abutment was swamped and lost. Tractors, drag lines, and heavy equipment disappeared into the churning slide. Of the 134 men working in the area at that moment, 34 were carried into the sliding material. 8 did not survive. Of those 8, only 2 bodies were ever recovered. 6 men remain entombed within the fabric of Fort Peck Dam to this day, as permanent and silent a presence as the earth itself. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. Engineers examined every possible mode of failure: movement along weak zones in the shale, excessive core pressure, liquefaction of the sandy shell or foundation material. Laboratory testing ultimately pointed most strongly to the bentonite seams within the Bear Paw Shale. As the enormous weight of the hydraulic fill had been placed overhead, it had generated extraordinary pore water pressures within the shale. Those pressures had no easy path of escape through the surrounding low permeability rock. The result was a dramatic reduction in effective stress and shear strength along the bentonite layers, a failure that was, in retrospect, almost waiting to happen. It was a lesson that would reshape geotechnical engineering practice for decades to come. Work resumed with modified procedures and heightened vigilance. The dam was completed in 1940. Electricity began flowing from its first powerhouse in July of 1943. A second powerhouse was completed in 1961. Together, the 5 generating units provide a nameplate capacity of 185.25 megawatts, split between the western and eastern electrical grids, powering communities across a broad swath of the American interior. Fort Peck became the first and highest of 6 mainstem dams the Army Corps of Engineers would construct along the Missouri River, a coordinated system stretching from Montana to South Dakota that together impounds roughly 73 million acre-feet of water. It is one of the great feats of managed hydrology in human history. In June of 2011, record flooding on the Missouri pushed Fort Peck to release nearly 66,000 cubic feet of water per second, nearly double any previous recorded release. The dam held. Repairs authorized afterward exceeded $42 million. Fort Peck Dam endures in American memory and American culture. Bourke-White's photograph gave Life magazine its inaugural face. Montana author Ivan Doig brought the human drama of its construction alive in his novel Bucking the Sun, tracing fictional families whose fates were bound up in the rise of the dam and the drowning of the farms that once lined the river above it. That first life cover image was later honored on a United States postage stamp, a small acknowledgement that what happened here mattered, that it was worth remembering. Fort Peck Dam is a monument to a particular and unrepeatable American moment, a time when the nation, brought to its knees, chose not to surrender but to build. It is the story of engineers confronting geological forces they had never fully faced before and finding answers in the wreckage. Of workers, tens of thousands of them, who came from broken places and built something that will outlast every one of us. Of men who never came home, whose names are known, and whose presence remains. It stands today beneath the wide Montana sky, holding back a lake the size of a small inland sea. Still working, still watched, still quietly magnificent. If you found this history worth knowing, subscribe for more stories of human ambition in steel, stone, and concrete.